At my cousin's lavish wedding, surrounded by 200 guests, my ex-husband leaned in, tapped his champagne glass, and smirked directly into my face. "Leaving you, Lauren, was the absolute best move of my life," he announced loud enough for the entire head table to hear. He thought he was about to humiliate me in front of our entire family, reduced to nothing more than a lonely ex-wife. But before I could even reply, a sudden sharp scrape of chairs echoed through the banquet hall. One by one, all 6 groomsmen stood up at attention, staring at him with total coldness. The lead groomsman stepped forward, saluted, and said, "Sir, I'd watch your mouth. You're speaking to our commanding officer." The smirk on my ex's face instantly vanished, and his glass slipped right through his trembling fingers. "My name is Lauren. I'm 42 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned about life, it's that people who try to destroy you often hand you the very blueprint for your rebuild. 5 years ago, on my 37th birthday, I walked into my own kitchen holding a box of bakery cupcakes, only to find my husband Mark holding my supposed best friend. There was no grand scene, no tearful apology, just Mark looking at me with cold condescension, telling me he was done. He assumed I was a frail, dependent spouse who would crumble without his corporate income and social standing. He packed his bags, took the joint savings, and left me with a lease I could barely afford, convinced I'd be begging for him back within 6 months. He was dead wrong. Instead of curling into a ball, I made a radical choice. I walked into a military recruiting office and applied for an officer candidate commission in the Army Logistics Corps. I traded my domestic life for pre-dawn rucks, relentless physical discipline, and tactical leadership. Over the next 5 years, while Mark was busy bragging around town about his new lifestyle, I was rising rapidly through the ranks, through sheer grit and unwavering focus, eventually taking command as a major leading a heavy logistics unit. I didn't announce my transformation on social media or broadcast it to extended family. I just did the work. And little did Mark know that quiet transformation was about to collide directly with his fragile ego. 5 years after the divorce, an invitation arrived in my mailbox for my younger cousin's wedding at an upscale estate on the coast. I hesitated at first, knowing how family functions can be a minefield of unwanted questions. But my cousin and I had grown up like siblings, and there was no way I was going to miss her big day. Then came the twist. 2 weeks before the event, my aunt called to let slip that Mark would be attending as well. It turned out he had recently partnered with the groom's family on a regional commercial development project and had aggressively maneuvered his way into the guest list, not just as an attendee, but as a primary sponsor of the open bar. Mark was eager to use the occasion to flaunt his newfound prosperity and parade his success in front of our shared relatives. Before I reveal what unfolded when our paths crossed at the reception, drop a comment below with the city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I knew Mark had spent the last 5 years spreading a false narrative to anyone who would listen, claiming I was living a broken, bitter life in isolation. He expected me to show up looking defeated, or better yet, not show up at all. Instead, I tailored my formal Army service uniform, polished my brass, and decided to attend alone, completely unbothered, unaware that the groom's main party held a massive surprise of their own. The cocktail hour was held on a sunlit terrace overlooking the ocean, filled with the hum of gentle jazz and clinking crystal. I held a glass of sparkling water, wearing my formal uniform, quietly catching up with a few relatives who were genuinely warm to see me. That peaceful moment didn't last long. From across the terrace, I saw Mark approaching, flanked by 2 of his corporate associates. He was wearing an expensive custom suit, walking with the puffed-out chest of a man who believed he owned the room. The moment his eyes landed on me, a smug, mocking grin spread across his face. He clearly assumed I was wearing a uniform as some kind of desperate cry for attention, or perhaps a costume to disguise how unsuccessful my life had become without him. He cornered me near the grand staircase, intentionally raising his voice so the nearby cluster of family members could hear every word. "Well, look at you, Lauren," he chuckled, his tone dripping with fake pity. "I see you're still playing dress-up. I guess when a real career doesn't work out, you have to hide behind brass buttons, huh?" He stepped closer, swirling the expensive scotch in his glass. "I was actually worried you'd be too embarrassed to show up today. But I'm glad you did. It gives me a chance to show you what real success looks like. Since I left, my firm doubled its revenue. I bought that beachfront property in Malibu, and honestly, walking away from you was the absolute best move of my life." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked him in the eye, took a calm sip of my water, and offered a faint, polite smile. That total lack of anger drove him absolutely crazy. The tension had been building all evening, but it reached its absolute boiling point during the formal dinner toasts. 200 guests sat at round tables draped in white linen, light filtering through chandeliers as the groom stood up to thank his wedding party. Mark was seated at a prominent table right near the front, clearly pleased with his high-visibility placement. As the clinking of glasses filled the room, Mark decided to make himself the center of attention once again. He stood up, tapped his champagne glass with a silver fork, and turned his gaze directly toward my table. The entire room grew quiet, sensing the awkward friction that had been simmering between us all evening. With a smug, triumphant grin, Mark raised his glass high into the air. He leaned forward, looking right at me, and said in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire banquet hall, "A toast to knowing when to cut your losses. Leaving you, Lauren, was the absolute best move of my life." Gasps echoed through the room. My aunt covered her mouth in shock, and several guests shifted uncomfortably, expecting me to break down in tears or storm out in shame. Instead, a sharp, synchronized scrape of wooden chairs suddenly shattered the silence. Before I could even blink, all 6 groomsmen at the head table stood up in perfect, rigid military formation. They didn't look at Mark with amusement. Their expressions were carved from ice. The lead groomsman, a muscular lieutenant colonel, stepped out from the head table, locked his eyes onto Mark, and rendered a crisp, precise salute toward my table. Turning back to Mark, his voice cut through the room like a razor. "Sir, I'd watch your mouth. You're speaking to our commanding officer." Mark's hand froze mid-air, his smug expression shattering into absolute terror. The champagne glass slipped through his trembling fingers, shattering against the parquet floor in a shower of crystal and foam. He spat out the wine remaining in his mouth, coughing frantically as his face turned a ghostly, chalky white. He stared at the groomsmen, then at me, unable to process what was happening. What Mark hadn't realized was that the groom's close circle of friends, the men standing firmly at attention right now, were active-duty officers assigned directly under my command in the logistics corps. The groom, a defense contractor, had met them through my department, but Mark had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he never bothered to ask how they were connected. "Commanding officer?" Mark stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager's. The lead groomsman didn't break eye contact. "Major Lauren Vance led our battalion through 2 overseas deployments," he said, his voice echoing across the silent banquet hall. "She commands over 600 personnel, manages a $50 million defense budget, and saved my men's lives in severe combat conditions. So unless you want to discuss what real leadership looks like, I suggest you sit down and shut your mouth." The contrast was brutal. In a matter of seconds, Mark was exposed for what he truly was, a small, insecure man boasting about inflated profits while standing in front of decorated officers who answered to the woman he had tried to humiliate. Whispers erupted across every table. Family members who had spent years listening to Mark's lies now stared at him with pure disgust and secondhand embarrassment as he stood there, completely undone. Mark's face cycled through a dozen emotions, from outrage to to panic, and finally, to sheer desperate embarrassment. As the silence in the banquet hall stretched tight, he realized his high-value business connections with the groom's family were crumbling right before his eyes. He frantically pulled a napkin from the table, trying to wipe the champagne off his polished shoes while mumbling half-baked apologies. Seeing the cold, unyielding stares of the 6 officers surrounding him, Mark turned toward my table and took a hesitant step forward. He attempted to switch tactics, forcing a weak, pathetic smile onto his face. "Lauren, look, I was just joking," he stammered, his voice lacking any of the boisterous confidence from earlier. "You know how I get with a little scotch in me. I was just trying to break the ice. We're all family here, right? Can we talk in private for a minute?" He reached out as if to take my elbow, hoping to drag me away from the crowd to salvage his reputation. But before his hand could even touch my sleeve, the lead groomsman shifted his frame slightly, placing a solid, broad shoulder directly between us like an iron wall. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my dress jacket, and looked down at him. My voice was quiet, perfectly calm, yet carried across the silent room with effortless authority. "5 years ago, Mark, you told me that leaving me was your best move," I said. "And for once in your life, you were right. Because when you walked out, you forced me to discover who I actually was without your dead weight. You built an empire out of hot air and arrogance. I built mine out of honor." Before he could say another word, the groom stepped over, placed a firm hand on Mark's shoulder, and quietly escorted him toward the side exit. Mark left the hall with his head bowed, totally defeated. 3 months have passed since that evening, and the dust has finally settled. After his humiliating display at the wedding, Mark's fragile empire began to unravel. Word of his behavior spread quickly among the groom's network, and several major investors quietly pulled their funding from his commercial development projects. Last I heard, he was forced to sell his Malibu property to cover mounting business debts and was quietly relocating to a smaller city to start over. As for me, that night wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. Standing in that banquet hall surrounded by people who respected me made me realize how far I'd come from the heartbroken woman sitting on her kitchen floor 5 years ago. I continued to serve as a major, leading my incredible unit and mentoring the next generation of officers. Life has a funny way of handing you exactly what you need, even when it feels like a disaster at the time. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you is simply the universe clearing the path for your greatest triumph. What about you? Have you ever had a moment where someone tried to humiliate you, only for it to completely backfire on them? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.